There is a game being played in every room you have ever walked into, at every table you have ever sat down at, in every relationship, every professional environment, every social structure you have ever been part of. It is being played right now by the people around you, with or without your awareness, with or without your participation. And the most important thing to understand about this game is not how to win it, it is that it exists. Because the majority of people, not out of stupidity, not out of naivety, but out of a very specific and very human discomfort with what acknowledgement requires, spend their entire lives pretending it doesn't. They tell themselves that relationships are purely organic, that outcomes are primarily meritocratic, that the people who rise do so because of competence alone, and the people who stay still do so because they simply haven't worked hard enough yet. These are comfortable stories. They are also, in almost every measurable way, incomplete. The game is the invisible architecture beneath the visible surface of human interaction, the layer of status, perception, influence, and social positioning that operates continuously, that shapes outcomes constantly, and that rewards those who understand it with a precision and consistency that baffles everyone who refuses to see it. This video is not a cynical argument. It is a precise one. And precision, here, begins with a willingness to see the board. The game is not a conspiracy. It requires no coordinated intent, no shadowy agreement between players, no deliberate designs. It is simply the emergent property of human social architecture, the predictable result of placing stat-aware, impression managing, resource-seeking animals inside hierarchical structures and watching what happens. What happens is this. People continuously, mostly automatically, assess and signal status. They manage the perceptions others hold of them. They navigate hierarchies that are rarely explicit and almost never acknowledged. They compete for attention, credibility, access, and social capital using strategies that are dressed almost universally in the language of something else. Ambition is dressed as passion. Status pursuit is dressed as excellence. Influence operations are dressed as authentic self-expression. Social positioning is dressed as coincidence. The game is not about malice. It is about the gap between what is publicly stated as the organizing principle of a social environment, merit, fairness, genuine connection, shared values, and what is actually organizing it at the structural level, status, perception, access, the management of how one is seen, remembered, and positioned in the minds of the people whose assessment carries weight. This is the game. It has always been the game, and the discomfort of naming it is not evidence that it isn't real. It is evidence of how effectively the game requires its own invisibility to function. The denial of the game is not random. It is motivated. There are specific, psychologically coherent reasons why acknowledging the game's existence is deeply uncomfortable for most people. And understanding those reasons is part of mastering the game itself. The first is moral discomfort. Acknowledging that human interaction is significantly shaped by status-seeking, impression management, and social maneuvering requires a revision of the self-concept that most people have invested heavily in. The person who believes they operate from pure authenticity, pure merit, pure relational warmth. The person who has built an identity around being above that kind of calculation cannot acknowledge the game without acknowledging their own participation in it. And that acknowledgement is threatening in direct proportion to how central the identity of non-participation is. The second reason is simpler. Seeing the game requires bearing a kind of knowledge that changes things. Once you understand the architecture of a social dynamic, once you can see the status negotiation inside a casual conversation, the influence operation inside a generous gesture, the positioning move inside a public display of vulnerability, you cannot unsee it. And that clarity, while powerful, is also a form of loss. The warm, simple story of human interaction being primarily about genuine connection becomes permanently complicated. Some people would rather keep the story. The third reason is social. Naming the game openly is itself a social violation, a breach of the collective agreement to maintain the fiction. The person who says out loud what everyone is privately doing is not rewarded for their accuracy. They are penalized for their disruption. And so most people learn early to see the game privately and deny it publicly, which is itself a move in the game. Every game has rules, not the stated rules, the actual ones, the ones that determine outcomes regardless of what the official framework claims is in operation. The first rule of the social game is that status is always being negotiated, and the negotiation is almost always nonverbal. It happens in posture, in pacing, in who speaks first and who waits, in who frames the terms of an interaction and who accepts the frame. The person in any exchange who is most comfortable with silence, most steady in the face of social pressure, most unconcerned with the other person's approval, that person has structural status in that moment, regardless of their formal position in any hierarchy. The second rule is that perception is reality, and reality is largely irrelevant. What you are matters far less, in almost every social context, than what you are understood to be. The architecture of how others perceive you, your competence, your value, your social weight, is a construction, and constructions can be engineered. The third rule is that attention is currency. In any social system, the person whose attention is most sought, least freely given, and most capable of conferring status through its direction, that person holds significant power, independent of any other resource. The fourth rule is that consistency of frame is dominance. The person who consistently defines the terms of an interaction, who establishes the interpretive framework through which events are understood, exercises a form of influence so structural that it rarely needs to be enforced. It simply shapes the space in which everything else occurs. One of the most misunderstood dimensions of the game is perception management, because it is almost universally discussed either as a shallow vanity project or as a cynical manipulation of others. It is neither. Perception management, practiced at the level of mastery, is the precise and deliberate cultivation of how you are understood, not to deceive, but to ensure that the understanding others have of you is accurate to the version of yourself you are actually operating from, rather than the distorted version their biases, projections, and incomplete data would produce if left unmanaged. Most people hemorrhage social and professional capital not because they are actually less capable or less valuable than they present, but because they have never taken responsibility for the signal they are broadcasting. They assume that competence speaks for itself, that quality is self-evident, that being a certain way is sufficient without any consideration of how that way registers in the perceptual field of the people whose assessment carries consequence. This assumption is expensive. The game does not reward the most competent player. It rewards the player whose competence is most legible, most consistently framed, most strategically positioned in the minds of the people who matter. Managing that perception is not performance. It is craft. And refusing to practice it is not integrity. It is abdication. The game operates with particular clarity in professional environments where the stakes are high enough that the mechanisms become easier to observe. The person who gets the promotion ahead of someone with equivalent or superior technical skill is almost always the person who has more skillfully managed the perception of their value, built more strategic alliances, positioned their work so that it is visible to the people whose assessment determines outcomes, and cultivated the quality of presence that signals readiness for the next level before the opportunity presents itself. None of this is unfair in the cynical sense. It is simply the full picture of what competence actually means inside a social system. Technical skill is one component. Social intelligence, the ability to read the room, navigate hierarchy, manage perception, and influence the frameworks through which your work is understood, is another. The person who has only the first and dismisses the second will consistently be passed by someone who has both, and will spend years misattributing the gap to politics, favoritism, or the world's fundamental unfairness. In social environments, the game is quieter, but equally consistent. Social capital, the currency of belonging, status, and influence within a community, is accumulated through the same mechanisms: frame control, attention management, strategic consistency of identity, and the cultivation of being understood as someone whose presence confers rather than diminishes value. These are learnable skills. They are not manipulation. They are fluency in a language that has always been spoken in every room you have ever occupied. This is the point that most people find most resistant to accepting. The belief that one can simply choose not to play can withdraw from the game through principled refusal, through a commitment to authenticity, through the decision to simply be rather than position, is one of the most persistent and costly misunderstandings in this entire domain. You cannot opt out of the game. You can only choose whether to play it consciously or unconsciously. The person who refuses to manage their perception is still broadcasting a signal. It is simply an unmanaged one, subject entirely to the interpretive biases of whoever is receiving it. The person who refuses to acknowledge status dynamics is still participating in them. Their refusal is itself a status move, read and responded to by everyone else in the room. The person who declines to cultivate social capital is not transcending the system. They are simply accumulating less of it and reducing their capacity to act effectively within every structure that runs on it. Opting out is not neutrality. It is the position of someone who has decided to play without understanding the rules. And in any game, the player who doesn't know the rules is not exempt from them. They are simply subject to them without recourse. Mastering the game is not about becoming calculating or cold. It is not about the permanent suspension of genuine connection in favor of strategic maneuvering. The master player is not someone who is always running an operation. They are someone who understands the architecture so completely that they no longer have to think about it consciously. The rules have been internalized. The dynamics are read automatically. The appropriate response, whether strategic, warm, direct, or deliberately ambiguous, is available without effort because the system is understood at depth. What mastery looks like in practice is this: steadiness. The master player is not reactive. They are not destabilized by status threats, not desperate for approval, not triggered by social pressure into behavior that doesn't serve them. They enter a room having already decided who they are in it. They manage their own state before they manage anything external. They understand that the most powerful position in almost any social dynamic is the one that requires the least maintenance, the position of genuine, unperformable confidence in one's own value. which generates status without the exhausting work of constantly asserting it. And they understand, critically, the difference between playing the game well and playing it predatorily. The game can be played with integrity. It can be played from values. It can be played in ways that create genuine value for everyone in the structure. Mastery is not the choice to exploit the game. It is the choice to be fluent in it, which is a very different thing. Understanding the game creates responsibility. Because once you can see the architecture of social influence, once the mechanisms of status, perception, and positioning are visible to you in real time, you have a choice about what to do with that visibility that most people never have to make. You can use it defensively, to protect yourself from influence operations run on you without your awareness, to navigate hierarchies with greater precision, to ensure your own value is legible rather than lost inside a system that defaults to rewarding the most visible rather than the most valuable. You can use it constructively to build environments where the game is played more transparently, where the rules are clearer, where the people inside the system are less subject to dynamics they can't see and therefore can't navigate. Or you can use it exploitatively, to extract, to manipulate, to position yourself through the deliberate diminishment of others. The first two are mastery. The third is predation, wearing mastery's clothing. The distinction matters not because exploitation is always externally punished, it frequently isn't, but because what you become through the sustained practice of exploiting what you understand is a specific kind of person. And that person, over time, loses access to the one thing that no social architecture can manufacture: the experience of genuine connection in a world they have chosen to see only as a system to be leveraged. The game has always been real. It was real in the first social hierarchy you were ever part of, long before you had language for what was happening. It is real in every room you occupy today. It will be real in every room you enter for the rest of your life. The question is not whether to acknowledge it. Acknowledgement was always the only honest position. The question is what you do with the acknowledgement, how you allow it to change not just your strategy but your perception, your presence, and your fundamental relationship to the environment you move through. The player who sees the board most clearly does not win because they are more ruthless. They win because they are more awake, because they are responding to what is actually happening rather than the story of what is supposed to be happening. Because they've accepted the full complexity of human social reality without needing it to be simpler or kinder or more straightforwardly meritocratic than it actually is. That acceptance, clear-eyed, undefensive, and ultimately freeing, is not cynicism. It is the specific form of clarity that makes everything else possible. See the board, learn the rules, decide from a position of actual understanding how you want to play. That decision made consciously, made from values, made with full awareness of what the game is and what it isn't, is the only move that has ever really been worth making.